So as I pointed the Aston south towards the Monza Autodrome, I mused about the season which was drawing to a close. I seemed to have picked the wrong races to watch in 1957. For the second year in a row, I'd given Le Mans a miss, only for privately entered Jaguar D-types to finish first, second, third, fourth and sixth, led by the Ecuria Cos car of Ron Flockhart and Ivor Buell. Then, in July, sadly, I couldn't make it to Aintree and missed seeing history being made as a British car, Vanwall, and British drivers, Moss and Brooks, won the British Grand Prix, the first time an all-British combination had won the home event. And then, a couple of weeks later, at the Nürburgring, Fangio drove what must be the finest race of his illustrious career, to win the German Grand Prix and clinch his fifth World Championship. So now I came to Monza with nothing really to play for and nothing much to prove, or so I thought. But how wrong could I be? Unlike last year, when both the road and the bank tracks were combined for use, the 1957 Italian Grand Prix was to use only the road circuit. Maserati had both 6 and 12-cylinder models at the disposal of their regular drivers, Fangio, Behra and Harry Schell. Vanwall, with both Moss and Brooks fit again and encouraged by their Aintree victory and Moss's beating Fangio into second place at Pescara recently, had 4 cars for 3 drivers, the third being for Stuart Lewis-Evans. Brooks was seen chatting to Bruce Halford, who had brought along a private 250F Maserati. Fangio would start practice with the V12 car, but as usual, he would be quicker in the 6-cylinder machine. There were no less than 5 Works Maseratis entered, and backing up the 3 regular drivers were Scarlatti and Maston Gregory. Godia's private car had also been entered by the Works, and there were another 5 private 250Fs on the entry list. Ranged against the Vanwalls and all these Maseratis would be 4 Lancia Ferraris for Luigi Musso, Mike Hawthorne, Peter Collins and Taffy von Trips, who had now recovered from the injuries he sustained in the Nürburgring 1,000-kilometre sports car race. Friday's practice had been a torrid affair, with a nail-biting battle between Moss and Fangio for fastest time of the day. That honour had finally gone to Moss, with a time of 1 minute 42.7. Fangio's best was some 4/10 slower, despite stretching his engine up to 7,900 RPM. It was clear that the Vanwalls had the speed, and only the genius of Fangio could get with them. The Lancia Ferraris had been nowhere. Von Trips, the fastest of the 4, was nearly 3 seconds slower than Moss. Saturday's practice session began at 3 in the afternoon, and it was still very hot. Hawthorne was the first to venture out in a modified long chassis version of the Lancia Ferrari. Then Lewis-Evans climbed aboard his Vanwall. He had only done a few laps the day before and was anxious to learn more of Monza. Moss discussed tactics with team manager David York. Hawthorne's Ferrari was visibly slower down the pit straight than the Vanwalls, and in the heat, no one in the Maserati camp seemed keen to go out. Out on the circuit, Mike Hawthorne was still struggling to get the Ferrari down to a competitive time. Lewis-Evans, on the other hand, was going very rapidly indeed, and before long had gone quicker than Moss's Friday time. This brought everybody else out, and Brooks then lapped quick enough to make it an all-Van Wall front row. 3 green cars ahead of the red of Italy, and at Monza too. I couldn't imagine that the Tifosi would stand for this come race day. Collins's car was wheeled away. Incredibly, his Lancia's V8 was no answer to Van Wall's 4-cylinder hybrid engine and its efficient, high-speed shape. It was just as hot on Sunday, but as the race was scheduled to start at 3 in the afternoon, which was the same time as practice had been on the 2 previous days, at least the teams would know exactly what the track conditions would be like, and there would be no excuse for a wrongly set up car. Berra, in number 4, had opted for the V12 Maserati. Fangio in 2 and Harry Schell in 6 would have the slower revving 6-cylinder machines. Only a broken magneto shaft on Lewis Evans's car, after he'd set that pole position time, had spoilt a clean sheet for Van Wall reliability, and there was little for their mechanics to do as they prepared for the race. The Van Wall engine is a combination of Norton motorcycle cylinder blocks and a Rolls-Royce crankcase, equipped, of course, with Vanderbilt thin wall bearings. The Ferrari Transporter arrived back from Modena and disgorged its cargo. It was car 30 for Collins, 32 for Musso, 34 for Von Trips, and 36 for Hawthorn. Ferrari was still relying on drum brakes over 4 years after Jaguar had set the way with disc brakes by winning races such as Le Mans. Ferrari had painted contrasting nose colours to add recognition as the cars approached the pits at high speed. Their best qualifiers, Musso and Von Trips, would start the race from the 3rd row. The world champion arrives, besieged as always by the autograph hunters, and behind him, Collins's green-nosed Ferrari. Moss's Van Wall appeared immaculate, ready for the off. A pipe-puffing Hawthorn was ready with a witty quote for the attendant journalists as the other 2 Van Walls were pushed out. Maurice Trintignant was there, but without a drive. And Fangio, who had won everything there was to be won, had regained the World Championship, his 5th, still was looking forward to a good race. Peter Collins still had a lot to prove. The Van Wall team was first to be ready before a wide-open Monza track. Never before had Van Wall looked so strong. Car 22 was to be driven by Tony Brooks, and it had a yellow noseband. Car 20 by Stuart Lewis-Evans with no noseband, and Car 18 by Stirling Moss, which had a white noseband. The officials in race control looked on as the mechanics wheeled out their cars onto the grid. And as usual, famous old driver Gigi Villoresi was around with words of wisdom for anyone who would listen.
Secondo arrivò proprio un amico Serena che abbiamo il piacere di adesso lo dico con la macchina speciale anche la partita del secondo che
There was a tightly packed crowd around Fangio, who for once was ready on the grid in good time, albeit looking as if he was about to get into the wrong car. Away went the flags of all nations, up went the Due Minuti board, and it was time to go. Moss got a superb start, and Berra, in the V12 Maserati, shot through from the second row to reach second place as they got to Lesmo Corner. At South Turn, it was Moss, Berra, Lewis-Evans, Brooks and Fangio. These five detached themselves from the rest. There was really nothing to choose between them, each in turn taking a spell at the front of this file. The battle for sixth place was equally fierce, with Schell, Collins, Musso, Hawthorne, and a brilliant young Bonnier in the Centro Sud Maserati, all equally matched. Now Berra had his nose in front of Moss again, and these two had pulled out further from the rest. But now Fangio led, and Berra had slipped to fifth behind the three Vanwalls. Next time round, Brooks led, the Vanwalls side by side as they screamed down the pit straight. Then it was Berra, Moss, Fangio, Brooks, Lewis-Evans. What a motor race. Musso and Hawthorne were locked in battle for seventh, with an overheating Bonnier not far behind. The leading five were by now lapping the back markers, and still there was no quarter being asked or given. But such epic battles never last forever. First to succumb was Brooks, who called at the pits to have a sticking throttle seen to. Collins was now fifth, with Hawthorne up to sixth, now that he was ahead of Musso. Brooks was recovering from his pit stop, but Lewis-Evans had had to retire with a cracked cylinder head. On lap 77, Moss pitted for new tyres, but was able to rejoin in the lead and ahead of Fangio. Berra was now out with engine trouble. Brooks, well down the field, was still really flying, and near the end set the fastest lap of the race, and managed that without a clutch. All of this action had allowed Hawthorne up to third, and then in the dying moments he too came into the pits with a misfire. This delay allowed Von Trips to inherit third place, 2 laps down, and Hawthorne slipped to 7th. Collins was in trouble too, motoring around slowly with a bent valve on his way to retirement. Hawthorne was back in the race and had got past Musso to take 6th place. Fangio, some 3/4 of a lap behind Moss, had to be content with hanging on to his 2nd place. Stirling continued untroubled at the head of the field, en route to an historic victory, and after 87 laps, at 193 kilometres an hour, he crossed the line. For the first time, a British car had beaten the Italians on their home track at Monza. Only Fangio went the full distance with Moss, and he then finished ahead of Von Trips, Gregory, Scarlatti, Hawthorne and Brooks. But the home defeat didn't seem to dampen the Tifosi's spirit, and the crowd round Moss was as frantic and as dense as it would have been if one of their beloved Ferraris had won. So Vanwall finished the season with 3 Grand Prix victories to Maserati's 4, all 4 achieved by the world champion Fangio. For Tony van der Poel's Vanwall team, it was a supremely satisfying end to a wonderful weekend. What would 1958 have in store, I wondered, for Britain's best Grand Prix team?